Welcome to the Folktale Project. This is Dan Scholz. Today we have our final story of Thanksgiving for the week, and hopefully everybody had an enjoyable and safe Thanksgiving yesterday. And although many of us did not and could not have the large family gatherings we so often do, I wanted to tell a story about such a gathering. This is a really wonderful tale, set, as many of the stories in the Topaz storybook are, around a dinner party. And in this dinner party, well, all of our favorite holidays are the guests. This is Mrs. November's Dinner Party by Agnes Carr. The widow November was very busy indeed this year. What with elections and harvest homes, her hands were full to overflowing, for she takes great interest in politics, besides being a social body without whom no apple bee or corn husking is complete. Still, worn out as she was, when her 30 sons and daughters clustered around and begged that they might have their usual family dinner on Thanksgiving Day, she could not find it in her hospitable heart to refuse, and immediately invitations were sent to her 11 brothers and sisters, old Father Time and Mother Year, to come with all their families and celebrate the great American holiday. Then what a busy time ensued! What a slaughter of unhappy barnyard families, turkeys, ducks, and chickens! What a chopping of apples and boiling of doughnuts! What a picking of raisins and rolling of pie crust, until every nook and corner of the immense storeroom was stocked with savory mince and toothsome pumpkin pies, while so great was the confusion that even the stolid, red-hued servant, Indian Summer, lost his head, and smoked so continually he always appeared surrounded by a blue mist as he piled logs upon the great bonfires in the yard until they lighted up the whole country for miles around. But at length all was ready. The happy days had come, and all the little Novembers in their best bib and tucker were seated in a row awaiting the arrival of their uncles, aunts, and cousins, while their mother, in russet brown silk trimmed with misty lace, looked them over, straightening Guy Fawkes's collar, tying Thanksgiving's neck ribbon, and settling a dispute between the two little presidential candidates as to who would sit at the head of the table. Soon a merry clashing of bells, blowing of horns, and mingling of voices were heard outside. Sleighs and carriages dashed up to the door, and in came, just in season, Grandpa Time with Grandma Year leaning on his arm, followed by all their children and grandchildren, and were warmly welcomed by the hostess and her family. "Oh, how glad I am we could all come today," said Mr. January in his crisp, clear tones, throwing off his great fur coat and rushing to the blazing fire. "There is nothing like the happy returns of these days." "Nothing indeed," simpered Mrs. February, the poetess. "If I had had time, I should have composed some verses on the occasion, but my son Valentine has brought a sugar heart, with a sweet sentiment on it, to his cousin Thanksgiving. I, too, have taken the liberty of bringing a sort of adopted child of mine, young Leap Year, who makes us a visit every 4 years. He is very welcome, I am sure," said Mrs. November, patting Leap Year kindly on the head. "And Sister March, how have you been since last we met?" "Oh, we have had the north, southeast, and west winds all at our house, and they've kept things breezy, I assure you. But I really feared we would not get here today, for when we came to dress, I found nearly everything we had was lent, so that must account for our shabby appearance." "He, he," tittered little April Fool. "What a sell!" And he shook until the bells on his cap rang, at which his father ceased for a moment, showering kisses on his nieces and nephews, and boxed his ears for his rudeness. "Oh, Aunt May, do tell us a story," clamored the younger children, and dragging her into a corner, she was soon deep in such a moving tale that they were all melted to tears, especially the little Aprils, who cry very easily. Meanwhile, Mrs. June, assisted by her youngest daughter, a sweet girl graduate just from school, was engaged in decking the apartment with roses and lilies and other fragrant flowers that she had brought from her extensive gardens and conservatories, until the room was a perfect bower of sweetness and beauty, while Mr. July draped the walls with flags and banners, lighted the candles, and showed off the tricks of his pet eagle, Yankee Doodle, to the great delight of the little ones. Madame August, who suffers a great deal with the heat, found a seat on a comfortable sofa as far from the fire as possible, and waved a huge feather fan back and forth with her 31 boys and girls, led by the 2 oldest, Holiday and Vacation, ran riot through the long rooms, picking at their Aunt June's flowers and playing all sorts of pranks, regardless of tumbled hair and torn clothes, while they shouted, "Hurrah for fun!" and behaved like a pack of wild colts let loose in a green pasture, until their Uncle September called them, together with his own children, into the library, and persuaded them to read some of the books with which the shelves were filled, or play quietly with the game of authors and the dissected maps. "For," said Mr. September to Mrs. October, "I think Sister August lets her children romp too much. I always like improving games for mine, although I have a great trouble in making Equinox toe the line as he should." "That is because you are a schoolmaster," laughed Mrs. October, shaking her head, adorned with a wreath of gaily tinted leaves. "But where is my baby?" At that moment a cry was heard without, and Indian Summer came running in to say that little All Hallows had fallen into a tub of water while trying to catch an apple that was floating on top, and Mrs. October, running off to the kitchen, returned with her youngest in a very wet and dripping condition, and screaming at the top of his lusty little lungs. He could only be consoled by a handful of chestnuts, which his nurse, Miss Frost, cracked open for him. The little Novembers, meanwhile, were having a charming time with their favorite cousins, the Decembers, who were always so gay and jolly and had such a delightful papa. He came with his pockets stuffed full of toys and sugar plums, which he drew out from time to time, and gave to his best-loved child Merry Christmas, to distribute amongst the children, who gathered eagerly around their little cousin, saying, "Christmas comes but once a year, but when she comes she brings good cheer." At which Mary laughed gaily, and tossed her golden curls, in which were twined sprays of holly and clusters of brilliant scarlet berries. At last the great folding doors were thrown open. Indian Summer announced that dinner was served, and a long procession of old and young was quickly formed, and led by Mrs. November and her daughter Thanksgiving, whose birthday it was. They filed into the spacious dining room, where stood the long table groaning beneath its weight of good things, while 4 servants ran continually in and out, bringing more substantials and delicacies to grace the board and please the appetite. Winter staggered beneath great trenchers of meat and poultry, pies and puddings. Spring brought the earliest and freshest vegetables. Summer the richest creams and ices, while autumn served the guests with fruit and poured the sparkling wine. All were gay and jolly, and many a joke was cracked as the contents of each plate and dish melted away like snow before the sun, and the great fires roared in the wide chimneys as though singing a glad Thanksgiving song. New Year drank everybody's health and wished them many returns of the day, while Twelfth Night ate so much cake he made himself quite ill and had to be put to bed. Valentine sent mottos to all the little girls and praised their bright eyes and glossy curls. "For," said his mother, "he is a sad flatterer, and not nearly so truthful, I'm sorry to say, as his brother George Washington, who never told a lie." At which Grandfather Time gave George a quarter, and said he should always remember what a good boy he was. After dinner the fun increased, all trying to do something for the general amusement. Mrs. March persuaded her son St. Patrick to dance an Irish jig, which he did to the tune of "Wearing of the Green," which his brothers, Windy and Gusty, blew and whistled on their fingers. Easter sang a beautiful song. The little Mays tripped to the light fantastic toe in a pretty fancy dance, while the Junes sat by so smiling and sweet it was a pleasure to look at them. Independence, the 4th child of Mr. July, who was a bold little fellow and a fine speaker, gave them an oration he had learned at school, and the Augusts suggested games of tags and blind man's bluff, which they all enjoyed heartily. Mr. September tried to read an instructive story aloud, but he was interrupted by Equinox, April Fool, and little All Hallows, who pinned streamers to his coat-tails, covered him with flour, and would not let him get through a line. At which Mrs. October hugged her tricksy baby and laughed until she cried, and Mr. September retired in disgust. "That is almost too bad," said Mrs. November as she shook the popper vigorously, in which the corn was popping and snapping merrily. But Thanksgiving you must not forget to thank your cousins for all they have done to honor your birthday." At which the demure little maiden went round to each one, and returned her thanks in such a charming way it was quite captivating. Grandmother Year at last began to nod over her teacup in the chimney corner. "It's growing late," said Grandpa Time. "But we must have a Virginia reel before we go," said Mr. December. "Oh, yes, yes," cried all the children. Merry Christmas played a lively air on the piano, and young and old took their positions on the polished floor with Grandpa and Grandma at the head. Midsummer danced with Happy New Year, June's commencement with August's holiday, leap year with May Day, and all went merry as a marriage bell. The fun was at its height, when suddenly the clock in the corner struck 12. Grandma Year motioned all to stop, and Grandfather Time, bowing his head, said softly, "Hark, my children, Thanksgiving Day is ended." And that is the quite honestly rollicking tale of Mrs. November's dinner party, in which we see all of the months and seasons and holidays gather for Thanksgiving. That is a story from Harper's Young People in November of 1883. And I dare say that Agnes Carr really captured it. This is Dan Scholes for the Folktale Project. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, anywhere you like to get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at Folktale Project. You can find us on Auto Radio, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, anywhere you like to listen. And you can always head over to folktaleproject.com, where you'll find a new story waiting for you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Next week, we'll be back with 3 new tales. As always, thank you so much for listening.